conversation with the RxJS Core Team. So just to give you a quick introduction for the ones who is watching this live stream the first time, JSKongress Meets Friends is a format where we want to invite people and teams where we think that they can answer some quite interesting stories of some tools maybe you're using as well, and also like getting some more insights which you can't read on the blog posts. You're also able to ask your question directly on Twitter using the hashtag JSKongress, or on the YouTube live chat, where I already see a couple of people chatting around. So welcome to this edition. I'm Johannes, I'm the MC for today. I'm one of the organizers behind JSKongress, and I'm happy to welcome Jan-Niklas, Tracy, Moshe, Ben, and Nicholas. So I would like to start with a quick warm-up question. So Jan-Niklas, let's start with you. Where are you currently located? How are you doing? And can you remember your first time you got in contact with RxJS?
Yes, and yes. Okay, so I'm located in Krefeld in Germany. I'm still melting because it's freaking hot here. And I'm definitely not able to handle heat properly, so I'm just dying and not properly or active in any way. What was the second question?
The second question was, how are you doing, and can you remember your first time
Yes.
in contact with RxJS?
Actually, quite funny. I'm not sure if the others know that, but the first time I worked with RxJS was in an Angular project, Angular 2, within the release candidate phase. And I worked for like half a year in that project, and I had no freaking clue about RxJS. I didn't get anything. And then I got in contact with Tracy and started contributing to the docs, and that's pretty much like how everything started. And before that, I was like using switch map all over the places pretty much, and subjects. Like cool. Professional.
So that's been a good transition to Tracy. So Tracy, who are you? Where are you currently located? And can you remember on your first time you get in contact with RxJS?
Sure. My name is Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet, and I'm currently located in Atlanta, Georgia. So all those Southerners out there. But my first contact with RxJS was actually, I was just learning JavaScript, and I knew Ben. Ben was a good friend already. And I said, okay, Ben, I got JavaScript down after my second week of JavaScript. And I went over to Netflix where Ben was working. I said, okay, teach me RxJS. And Ben opened up Code Sandbox or whatever we were using. And he was like, okay, cool. Here's an observable, blah, blah, whatever. And then shortly thereafter, he's like, let's take a step back and why don't we learn JavaScript first? So that was my first experience with RxJS, and obviously come a long way since then.
Moshe, who are you? Where are you currently located? And can you remember on your first contact with RxJS?
Sure. So my name is Moshe Kolodny. I am located in New York. And my first contact with RxJS was when I joined the Firebase team. We were working on the Firebase console, and it was an Angular 2 AngularJS hybrid application. So my first contact with RxJS would probably be NGRX with the Redux version of Angular, or the Angular version of Redux. So that was my first experience with it.
Nicholas, can you tell us who are you? Where are you currently located? And what was your first contact with RxJS?
Yeah, sure. I'm Nicholas Jamieson. I'm located in Brisbane in Australia. And my first contact with RxJS would have been in the Angular 2 beta, fairly early beta. I'd used .NET versions of Rx before. And Angular 2 and the beta and the pre-release and all that sort of a saga was my introduction to RxJS.
So Ben, who are you? Where are you currently located, and what was your first contact with RxJS?
Well, my name is Ben Lesh. I'm currently in Austin, Texas. Just not but a year ago, I was in the Bay Area at Google, and before that Netflix. And my first contact with RxJS was at Netflix, where it was sort of, I don't know, thrust upon me. And I was like, what is this? Is this like Lodash, or why do we have this? So I am the RxJS team lead now. And that started because while I was at Netflix, there was an effort to rewrite RxJS, and I was tapped to do that, despite some protest on my part that I was not qualified to do that. But here I am. Turns out I was qualified, I guess, and I'm still working on it 5 or 6 years later. So.
Good. So thanks for the introduction and for giving a quick introduction, quick intro of you. So glad that you joined the session, and let's start kicking off the questions. So I'm pretty sure a couple of humans watching the streams are not so sure about what is Rxjs. So can you give us a brief overview? What is Rxjs?
So per se, Rxjs is the kind of default implementation for reactive programming for JavaScript. So it's not really much about Rxjs particular, but for using that properly, you need to embrace a reactive mindset, like you need to get used to functional programming. And what this reactive programming is pretty much about is the propagation of change. So something is happening, some change is happening. How do I react to that? Instead of saying, okay, please do that kind of change. And this is a fundamental way how to treat programs pretty much. And Rxjs provides the observable entity to deal with those kind of changes. That's like on a very high level what Rxjs deals with, from my point of view. I see Ben nodding, so this is like agreement.
All right, and how does Rxjs make the life of an engineer better? Like, what are the advantages when I'm using it?
So RxJS is great for when you're working with highly type of events that could change over time. So when you need to compose those events or do things with complex workflows and pipelines for different things, you have click events coming in, then you have transitions, and you have all these different user events and page load events and different things happening on the page at the same time. Coordinating all that becomes a nightmare if anyone's done it manually, but you could create beautiful pipelines in RxJS to be able to manage that. And you could build up, you could start simple and build up. So there's no need to kind of go all out to start. So there's a ramp up period as well. So that's a couple of ways where it makes things much easier to do.
Mm-hmm. And what are the core concepts behind Rxjs?
Yeah, there's a handful of core concepts and that are tangible, and there's an intangible one. I'd say that the core concepts are really observables, observers, and operators. Observables are sources of notifications. Observers subscribe to those observables to receive the notifications. And operators are functions that take an observable and return a different observable. So they're able to change the notifications that come from a source and flow to the sink. The easiest way to sort of explain those components is to sort of use an analogy. So an observable is kind of like an event emitter, but an event emitter just emits one type of event, whereas an observable has 3 types of notifications. It can give you a value notification to give you a value. It can give you an error notification to tell you that an error has occurred, and it can give you a complete notification to tell you that there are going to be no further notifications from that observable. So it's kind of like an event emitter, but it does a lot more. And observers are kind of like the listener for your event emitter. But instead of just receiving one type of event, you receive the notifications from the observables. Operators, the analogy for an operator would be something like the methods that are on an array. In JavaScript, you've got methods like map and filter that allow you to manipulate the elements of an array. Operators are kind of similar. They allow you to manipulate the notifications that are coming from a source and being received by a sink. So similar to the operators that are used in Lodash. In fact, some people sort of refer to RxJS as the Lodash for events. And you can sort of fit those analogies together to explain that sort of terminology. But there is another sort of core concept that's largely intangible, and that's the guarantees. Rx gives you a bunch of guarantees, behavioral guarantees. For example, if an observer receives an error notification from an observable, it's guaranteed that it will receive no further notifications from that observable. Similarly, if it receives a complete, it's guaranteed not to receive any further notifications from the source. And combined with those guarantees, those core components, observables, observers, and operators allow you to declaratively compose fairly complicated flows that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have those guarantees. If you didn't have the guarantees, you'd be doing the sorts of things you might have to do with an event emitter, where you'd have all sorts of if statements and things like, if this has happened and this has happened, then do this. But the fact that it gives you those three sort of core components and the guarantees means you can build all sorts of interesting things declaratively.
I think I first got in contact with reactive extensions for Java a couple of years ago. So there is RxJava, Rx.net. .NET, for example, can be used with JavaScript. Would it be better to use RxJS instead of Rx.net?
So, I mean, if you're targeting JavaScript or TypeScript, you're probably better off using RxJS. Rx.net, as far as like, I'm not even sure what you would do to use Rx.net to target JavaScript. I'm assuming there's some sort of compilation step where it compiles the C# into JavaScript or something like that. But that's actually where RxJS was born. Like originally there was this project a long time ago called Microsoft Project Volta, which actually used the ReactiveX logo as its logo at Microsoft. And the goal of it was to compile C# to JavaScript. And ultimately, I believe it was axed because TypeScript became so popular and kind of fit that need better. But RxJS was originally developed as a compilation target for Rx.net. So it had this roughly the same shape. And when they built C# down to JavaScript, they could use that library. But to my knowledge, it's the only surviving piece. I might have butchered some of that history, but I'm sure Matt Podwasecki will jump in at some point in comments and tell me where I was wrong. But that's the basic gist of it. So if you're targeting JavaScript or TypeScript, I would recommend using RxJS.
All right. So we got a pretty good overview about what is RxJS, what are the concepts behind, and what are the main advantages by using it. So it would be interesting, about seeing how widely it's used. Do you track any numbers of downloads, like on NPM? Because a lot of other libraries and frameworks are making use of RxJS. Would be interesting to get a kind of number if you have something.
Yeah, RxJS right now, I believe last week it was about 19 million per week. So that number is consistently growing over time, which is awesome. RxJS is the only external dependency in Angular. So a lot of growth is in Angular, but actually RxJS exceeds the number of NPM downloads from Angular. And that's because a lot of folks are using RxJS, whether it's with vanilla JavaScript or React or Vue. Another thing is, I think it's interesting to see the React adoption. So Ben and I run Rx Workshop, and it's great to see like people from Angular, people from React, and people from Vue all coming to these workshops to learn. As people are moving away from Redux, we're actually seeing more people use RxJS for cases where they want cancellation or streaming data that they want to compose. So the growth is very exciting. In fact, Ben is actually doing React full-time now. He was previously on the Angular team, but now he's full on React. And I think a lot of us are actually. I know Nicholas is too. So.
Regarding the numbers, Nicholas wrote a tool to anonymously report the usage of the RxJS API. How did the idea came up and how does it work? Can you tell us about it, Nicholas?
Sorry, what was the question?
You wrote a tool to anonymously report the usage of
okay.
API.
Yeah, that largely came from a discussion that we had in the core team meetings where we talk about just how are people using the API. So I wrote that on the weekend because it was related to some other code I'd been working on. I haven't had a look at the actual reported stats this morning. I did have a look yesterday after I woke up, and disappointingly, there were two people had reported their usage stats. But I'll have a look and see what's there later today. One person did report a bug, which was cool. He reported a bug, he actually fixed the bug, and then he reported his stats. So that is awesome. But yeah, it's the point of the main thing I wanted to do was just give people a way of doing it where it was completely anonymous and not automated. I didn't want to have something that ran in the background when you were installing RxJS because it takes a bit of time. It's also not something I'd be particularly comfortable doing, sending information from someone's computer when they're just installing a package. But yeah, not too many results reported yet, but it's promising. Hopefully it'll give us a good view of what people are using. Interestingly, a couple of the things that were reported did have a whole bunch of different versions of RxJS and different versions of TypeScript installed. So it's obviously a mono repo they'd run it on. But yeah, interesting from a number of points of view.
So I would like to report the usages in my projects as well. Where do I find this tool and how can I enable it? Is a lot of configuration needed? Like, is it a lot of effort to do, or is it just like add this dependency and it runs out of the box?
You can add the dependency. I posted a blog post on Twitter the other day. It sort of explained how to do it in the blog post. So if anyone wants to use the tool, I should go and have a look at that. If anyone's using any of my packages, any of the packages that I've authored, I've added the tool as a dependency of the package. So if you're using the ESLint rules that I've written or the TSLint rules that I've written, you'll have the tool installed. So all you need to do in that case is run npm rxjs-report-usage, and it will gather the usage, it will show you the usage, and it will prompt you whether or not you actually want to send it to the core team. And if you say yes, send it, it'll just post it to a Google form and we can go and gather it later. So if you're using either of the rules, ESLint, TSLint, or if you're using RxJS marbles or RxJS, etc., you'll already have the tool installed and you can just run it. Alternatively, you could use npx and run it directly, which will download the script for you and run it. So you can run npx rxjs-report-usage, and it will gather the usage, show it to you, and prompt you to send it.
All right. So for those who are interested, Nicholas' Twitter handle can be found in the description below this live stream. And I think it's the first tweet who is mentioning that tool and also gives you a link to the blog post and yeah, how and where you can use it.
It's a big deal. Please do that if you're listening to this, because it'll help us out a lot.
So let's continue with this question. This is not marked right now in the document, and I think that's quite interesting. What's the intention behind? What are your expectations on getting more and more metrics on that? Is it about the usage, what you're tracking? You already mentioned like the different versions which are used outside, which are RxJS versions, which TypeScript versions. Like, what are your expectations about the metrics you're gathering? Are there any?
Well, RxJS itself has a huge API surface area. So one of the things that's interesting that we can get out of this is like some metrics on what parts of RxJS are being used frequently. And that'll give us an idea if there's anything that we could maybe deprecate and remove, or anything that we should prioritize for performance reasons or that sort of thing. Like if we know that everyone is using window in operator for some reason, this is the polar opposite of reality. I don't think a lot of people are using that, but if there's a lot of people using it for some reason, then we know we don't want to de-optimize it, or we know that we don't want to deprecate it and remove it or something like that. Just things of that nature. It helps guide us with decisions if we have more knowledge about how people are using the library.
So Rxjs has been public a couple of years ago. It would be interesting, like getting a quick overview, like how it evolved until now, regarding architecture, regarding the team size, regarding the processes you're using. Can you give us a brief overview about that, Ben?
Sure. So actually, a lot of the team that you see before you, excluding Tracy, is fairly recent in the history of the team, as far as it's just been the last year and a half or maybe a little longer that we've had these folks on. But the team evolved in that originally it was this kind of skunkworks project at Netflix, where I was working with a guy named Paul Taylor that worked with me at Netflix, who was the original kind of architect of a lot of the pieces of RxJS as it exists. And a guy named Jafar Hussein, who's on the TC39, who had the observable proposal in front of the TC39 on behalf of Netflix. And I was steering the project, even though I wasn't the primary architect of a lot of the features, for a while. And then Paul left Netflix, and then after that, it was just me working on it. And OJ showed up. So OJ Kwan, who's not with us today, but he's still on the core team and he meets with us all the time. He started reviewing my pull requests, thank God, because I didn't have anyone to review my pull requests because it was just me. Eventually, I asked him just to join me because he was submitting his own PRs and that sort of thing. So then it was me and him. Andre Stultz was with us to write documentation for a while. And then we had David Driscoll joined us for some time. He's mostly inactive, but he's still on the core team. And we see him from time to time. And then just over time, Tracy joined to help the project and help promote RxJS and that sort of thing. And then we have Jan-Niklas joined us to work on the docs. I don't know how Jan-Niklas found us. Did Tracy find you, or you volunteered for something Tracy was looking for?
That's what I think is so awesome about, docs and things like that, right? Like a lot of the team, the current team, like came together just from the core team saying, hey, we need help with the docs, like just come help out. And, we've been so grateful that folks who were just working on docs and helping out have kind of transitioned to actually being part of the core team. So it's just been really nice to see. But yes, I think Jan-Niklas started helping out with the docs, and, the rest is history.
Yeah. So as far as the ownership of the project goes, the original version of RxJS was a Microsoft open source project. And there was agreement amongst folks in the ReactiveX community, which was not a Microsoft organization, that it should be moved under ReactiveX. Microsoft was okay with it. And so that's why if you ever look at the license is kind of strange. The license says copyright Microsoft, copyright Netflix, copyright Google, and contributors. So, and that was just, there were lawyers that were scary that were involved with that. When you get like an email from a lawyer from like one of these, multi-billion-dollar companies, and you're just like, oh, I'm gonna get one of these other lawyers from the company I work for to deal with this, because I don't know how to reply or if I even should reply to this. So that was the agreement that was laid out, and so now it's a true open source project in all respects. That it's not behind anyone's agreements or anything weird like that, like some of the corporate open source projects are. So that's the only thing that's unique about it is it was a Microsoft thing that Microsoft allowed to go full on open source, and it's been following contributors wherever it goes between jobs and that sort of thing since.
I'm pretty sure the next question you will hear it a lot of times, because when talking like with people who are maintaining a core library, a core framework, anything which that high visibility is, like they're telling me like the most common question they got asked on conferences or on Twitter or wherever is like, when is the next release coming around the corner? So it's an honor to ask this question to you directly. So when is the next release of our RxJS is scheduled?
We've been talking about it internally, and it's any day now. I think there's still a few pull requests that are happening. And version 7 right now is still in beta. And we're hoping to get it out of beta very soon. The few things that we've been working on are mainly kind of resolving some typings issues and figuring out what to do with the new animations frames API. So nothing too crazy. I think all of us are charging ahead and looking forward to RxJS 8, which has been in conversation, but obviously focused on making sure 7 gets out of beta first.
Mm-hmm. And to that end, I would recommend people try the beta. We'll probably publish another beta here very soon. There's just a couple of issues that we were waiting for PRs to land on, and I think we landed them yesterday maybe. But I recommend people do try the beta. And just for reference, Google actually uses, so the way that Google does Angular and uses RxJS is different because Google has an internal mono repository that's massive. It's this super huge thing. And they have one version of every library in their mono repository. So what they do to get the latest version of RxJS is they literally pull it on occasion off of master, and they see if it works internally. They give us feedback if we break something, so we know before we even publish a release. And then they actually use a version from master on our repository. So technically, when you're using things like YouTube or some of the other Google properties, you're actually using something that's using RxJS version 7, like pre-published, like in production. So if it weren't stable, we would know big time by now. So it's a pretty stable thing. Like right now, the real thing is we just want to try to settle some of the typings things, and that takes time. And it takes time because a lot of people are used to these corporately backed open source projects that are big, like Angular and React and that sort of thing, or even Vue. It's not corporately backed directly, but they have, you know, dedicated full-time employees kind of working on it that are paid from various funds. We're all doing this voluntarily, so the work that we get done on it is sporadic based on our day job workload and our personal lives. You know, if one of us that works on it a lot has our parents' home wiped out by dam explosions or whatever that actually happened, like there's some work that stops for a little bit. So these are things that I think are sometimes hard for people to swallow or hard for people to understand, like why RxJS would take a while. Especially when I worked at Google, people thought that it was my full-time job there, and it never ever was. So. You know, it's just something to keep in mind when we were like, oh yeah, it's a new day now, and 2 months go by, and then finally maybe we release another one kind of thing. It's because it's all volunteer work.
So what would be a good way to start supporting the project? Like, do you have regular meetings? Can I just pick up an issue on GitHub? What would be a good approach? What would you recommend someone who is interesting, but for example, hasn't contributed to an open source project so far?
So apparently contributing to the docs is very valuable and takes a lot of work for me. So I really appreciate anyone who wants to contribute to the docs, especially as it's far easier than contributing to the actual code base without any bad blood then. But so if anyone wants to contribute, honestly, I think the first thing that would be my go-to is like reach out to me probably, so that we can figure out how to contribute on the docs. If someone is really super passionate, and I don't want anyone to force to do docs work if you don't want to, but for other work, he probably needs to reach out to one of those guys. at least not me.
Well,
we're
even
all happy to help too. Like we're all happy to chat and whatever.
I was just gonna say on the coding side of things that it's doc related is one of the things people ask for all the time are more realistic examples for the docs. So, and that's legit writing code, but like, and the code has to work, but you know, it's for documentation and it's a big deal because I would say that the documentation code probably has a more of an effect on people's day-to-day lives using RxJS than the actual internals do. So I would definitely recommend if you see a really dumb or a simplistic example and you can think of a real world one that you can stuff in a stack blitz or whatever, then by all means contribute that, because that would be a big help.
All right, so to those who are interested, like supporting the project, please get in contact, like take a look at the repository or ping someone of the people here in the live stream. The Twitter handles are all linked in the description. I'm pretty sure everyone is happy to get some support on. So we talked right now about what is Rxjs in general, about the history and the future. Let's talk about the present. What's a good way to start actually with Rxjs? Would you recommend just reading through the docs? Are there any boilerplate projects I can reuse? What would you recommend?
So even though the docs are obviously amazing and there's like brilliant content in there, everything is super clear, I would probably rather recommend so the thing I mentioned before is that you don't really need to learn about all the operators. That's not if you start off with Rxjs, that's not really interesting. What you need to do is like getting this different mindset, and this is actually the difficult task to achieve. As soon as you got this, like, okay, how is this observable working and what is it there for? After that, you will notice that operators and all this nasty stuff is like way easier. So honestly, what I figured out is the best is just like building stupid stuff with Rxjs. And therefore, I personally would recommend, like, you're already using whatever technology, just try to add Rxjs and maybe build a feature that you already have implemented with Rxjs. Or if there's nothing right now coming out of your head, maybe implement a type ahead search, drag and drop, carousel, those kind of event-oriented things. These are really good for Rxjs and will really help you also to figure out where the strengths of Rxjs are and what the benefit of using it is. So this would probably be my go-to. There are some good resources that I like to recommend, and one is Learn Rxjs and one is Reactive How. Learn Rxjs has kind of this approach of having like, here's an example use case and we use these operators for that. And the other one, Reactive How, is for this, you already have to be kind of familiar with Rxjs because it's showing the differences between operators. But the animations are beautiful and it's really helpful if you're struggling, like, okay, what's the difference between switch map and merge map, for example? So these would be my other two go-to resources, and the docs for sure. There, the docs are great. Docs are great.
So let's assume I already started and I'm getting more and more into Rxjs. I want to use it more and more and more in my daily routines during web development. How is making Rxjs web development even better as it is right now?
So a lot of the things with Rxjs, dealing with values that change over time and that are going and passing by over time. If you try to do that manually, and I remember like the early days of jQuery, having event emitters and trying to wire things together, it becomes a mess, an absolute nightmare to be able to manage all the different things happening. Keeping track of state is a monster. You know, you pretty much have to write a state machine with all these different permutations of every variable that could happen. RxJS, because of the guarantees that Nicholas was mentioning before, provides some sanity around a lot of the structure on that. So you know that as these events happen, I have an operator that will stop, this stream of events if something else happens, and I could repeat it on a different stream, and I could, have an interval on doing it a certain amount of times or a certain in certain combinations or permutations of events that happen, and pretty much the sky's the limit. So trying to do that by hand is, for all intents and purposes, impossible unless you are just superhuman. So having a well-tested, well-documented, understood library doing all that nitty-gritty plumbing for you just makes everything so much easier.
All right, so you just mentioned state management as well. This brings me to Redux. Redux, React, RxJS, like all of them are dealing around with states. Besides React, like Redux is the mainly supporting library therefore. But let's talk about Redux and RxJS. Can they be used together? Do they make each other redundant? Like, what is your experience on that and your recommendation?
Yeah, you can definitely use Redux and RxJS. They solve different problems. You can use React, Redux, and RxJS all together at the same time. Redux Observable is a package that does just that. Whether or not you should really depends upon how familiar you are with each of the individual pieces. If you're familiar with React and you're familiar with Redux and you're familiar with RxJS, you might want to use something like Redux Observable to solve a problem. Basically, those things do different things. RxJS, in that sense, is managing asynchronous effects that are actually happening inside of Redux, whereas Redux is providing solving a different problem. It's giving you a global store with action-based changes. So they certainly don't make each other redundant. You can definitely use both. It really depends upon what you're trying to do and the problem that you're trying to solve. And if it fits with the problem that you're going to try to solve, then definitely use all three. An example of a situation where it might make sense to use those is if you have a large application and you have, not all backends are ideal from a front end sort of perspective. So you often have to deal with backends that are fragmented. And when something happens on the front end, you might have multiple requests going off to the back end. Anytime you need to coordinate those sorts of things, RxJS is a good candidate. So if you did have a large Redux application and you had a fragmented backend and you wanted to organize a bunch of backend requests when actions are occurring, it would make sense to use RxJS and Redux to solve that problem. But I'd approach it in that way. I'd look at the problem that you need to solve, look at the tools that you have, look at how they solve problems, and figure out whether or not they're appropriate for your application. But they're definitely different. It neither makes the other redundant, and you can definitely combine the two or the three.
Let's go to the next section, which is about the insights. I'm curious, like I see you folks on a lot of conferences. I've seen you in the past, not right now, but I'm interested, how do you receive feedback from the developer community, like from the community who is using RxJS, from the different people? Where do you get your feedback about which features can be added, which features needs to be optimized in that way?
So there are, for sure, like the obvious platform is GitHub, where we receive issues, pull requests, and stuff like that. Also, every one of us is fairly active on Twitter, so people are reaching out to us like, okay, I have this problem, what's the matter? And from those kind of things, we can see like, okay, maybe this is too complicated or needs some adaptation. The same goes for Stack Overflow issues. So every one of us is fairly active on Stack Overflow. We have a GitHub channel where some of us sometimes pop in to help out, but also in general, the community is fairly active in GitHub there. We have Slack, which is not that actively used from the community, but we use it to organize our work. And for sure, every one of us is going to conferences, speaking to people, doing talks, goes to meetups, stuff like that. I think these are pretty much like the main things. And actually, funny thing, the animation frame observable was pretty much born at RxJS Live last year. So like Ben kind of gathered that feature anonymously from seeing the talks and was like, oh no, that can't be the proper solution for that. Let's build a thing for that.
Yeah, there's another distinct difference between like our team and a lot of, say, like the core like framework teams, which is and it's partially born out of the fact that we're all volunteer workers on this. But and not the Angular team, I was on the Angular team. Everyone that I worked with was amazing, super smart, wonderful people. But they're heads down working on Angular the whole time, right? So that means that they aren't spending most of their day using Angular the same way that other people would. They use it, but they use it in kind of like when you're writing tests and you're working on the Angular team, you write up these contrived tests that are to test specific parts of the framework, as opposed to dealing with very, very large apps. Now, sometimes we would get called to help somebody in the rest of Google or something and help them with an actual app, but most of the work there in the Angular team, and I'm sure it's the same way for the React team and maybe to a lesser degree for the Vue team, but like you're working on the framework in the library and it's all conceptual, like how it's being used. Where every single one of us has a regular day job, and at least I assume everybody else here is using RxJS all the time at work. You get a pretty good idea of things that you would like to see changed or fixed. Things that I don't even know if I've ever documented, but I'll look at things like group by, and it's got 3 arguments, and I really wish it was, a configuration object that was passed, so I knew what the arguments were, because I don't always remember the order of the arguments, and I wrote the darn thing. So like, there's things like that we encounter when we're working with things, or even small bugs that get caught by folks in the team. And I think those obviously will get faster attention from us because we're the ones that found it. But there's also, GitHub issues and that sort of thing. Sometimes when I find an issue myself, I'll go and I'll look on GitHub and nobody else has ever reported it, which is always shocking to me. And then there's other times where I'll find it, I'll see somebody reported it. I wasn't able to reproduce it that time or whatever, and it got closed. And I'll be like, oh, I feel so bad. I did find this, but yeah, we all use it all the time. So I think that's another big source of where we find out what hurts the community. So
it's a kind of eating your own dog food.
Oh yeah, yep.
All right, so we've talked about all the contributions and issues. One thing I think everyone in the IT is affected at is like the topic technical debt. What's your strategy to deal with technical debts?
So I'm assuming you're asking, is it tech debt that you're asking about, technical debt? Yeah. Technical debt is difficult on a library this is widely used as what we have, because, for example, there's a couple parts to this. One is we have a lot of tests over the entire breadth of everything that we're doing. So if there's tech debt within this utility library, which it exists, but it's fairly minimal, ideally we can refactor something without having to change any tests. And if the tests still pass, then we know that we didn't break anything. So there's that side of it. But the biggest and most important thing is making sure that whatever tech debt that we're trying to fix is done in such a way that we're not releasing, a patch that's going to break a million projects or something like that. For example, recently we had some tech debt on subject, which is one of the major types within RxJS. And what it was we started working on RxJS, or I started working on RxJS, but way back when, I think it was like TypeScript 1.8 was the most popular version of TypeScript out, and TypeScript 2 or 2.1 was just being released. And it didn't support certain features. So if you made a subject of void, in order to call next, you had to pass undefined to it. And that made it unergonomic for some of Angular's use cases. So we made the value to next optional, even though it's not actually optional. It was optional in TypeScript. It said, you don't have to pass the value here. So if you made a subject of number, TypeScript will allow you to this day in version 6 to call next with no number passed to it. And that's actually incorrect. It can cause bugs and you shouldn't be able to do that. But it was a bit of tech debt. And it was tech debt because we had to wait for TypeScript to get to the point where if you had a subject of void, it automatically allowed you to call next without an argument, which it does now. So we had to go through and we had to fix that. We had to fix it in a major version, because if we were to fix that, even though it's a bug in our types, if we were to fix that and publish it in a patch for version 6, or even a minor for version 6, even though it's a bug fix, it would break so many people and so many builds that it would be untenable as a patch. So we had to make sure that we consider how many people are using this, because it gets downloaded so many times per week, and how many people will break. So it varies a little bit. If it was my own personal project that I see only like 20 downloads on, fine, we can publish a patch for the type change. And if it breaks all of 12 people, and maybe I get a nasty gram at some point. But if we publish something that breaks a lot of people, and I've done this in the past before any of these folks I think were even here. Like I start getting texts and messages and pinged at 1 a.m. from people who are noticing that their continuous integration builds are broken and they don't know why. And then they figure out it's RxJS, and then I have a meltdown. So we need to make sure that we carefully consider every change that we make, especially those that we think are just tech debt or bug fixes, because it's such a widely used project. It also means we have to move a lot slower because it's used by so many folks.
What's been the situation and like the task, how you resolved the meltdown you just mentioned? Like, did you jump out at 1 a.m, coordinate like who is jumping on, investigating, fixing the bug? Like, how was this situation for you?
Oh, that particular moment in time, honestly, it was no different than what would happen if you're on call at any other job, right? Like I saw, oh my gosh, all this stuff's happening, and basically I got up, washed my face, went to a computer and figured out what the issue was, resolved it, and published another patch that fixed people. But it was embarrassing and and difficult, and that stuff has happened early on. It happened a few times, but it hasn't happened in a long time since. Now we have wonderful folks that are helping us so Michael James Parsons and Christine Legg are at Google. Moshe also used to do this at Google, and I did myself. I started this group at Google before we left, that are actually the people responsible for pulling in what's an RxJS master into Google. And that means it gets run against thousands of targets, and we see if we broke anything, or we broke people's tests, or we broke functionality, or we broke people's builds. And we get feedback about it before we ever publish a version to NPM. So that's been a big stopgap for preventing those sort of things from happening again.
So it's already time asking the last question. So the last question is from me, and I'm interested, like, what is your recommended resource? Like, when I want to keep updated what's going on RxJS, like about ongoing discussions, new releases would be the best source, GitHub, the website, Twitter. What's your recommendation? Tracy.
What's my recommendation for getting started with RxJS?
Just for getting and keep getting updated, like the source of, I am interested in like what are ongoing discussions, what's discussed around the process right now, like when new releases are happening.
Yeah,
favorite.
I think it's difficult because I think a lot of those conversations are happening internally, right? For those people who are interested in contributing, I know I don't know if any of you guys else can, but you can always ping me on Twitter at Lady Elite, and I can give you access to the Slack channel. So that's the Slack channel is mainly for contributors. So if you're really interested in contributing and you kind of want to be able to start conversations about the contributions, then that is a great place to be. I think issues as well is a great place to be. You know, we'll randomly tweet out updates on Twitter as well. But I don't know if anybody else has any other suggestions, but those are the main ones that I can.
So one of the things I would suggest is following all these other folks you see here who are not me on Twitter. I know that seriously, everyone here but me actually outputs a lot more content that's RxJS related, as far as what's happening now, or like what are new tools or different techniques and that sort of thing, than I do. I think maybe I used to, and then I just got caught up with all sorts of other things or whatever. But that's not the point. The point is that these other folks that are on this call, they output a tremendous amount of great material for you to follow, or you to know about. I will occasionally tweet something like I'll put up some issue or some pull request that has some idea that I have, and ask for feedback kind of thing. But that I do that very rarely. And even actually going into this talk, I really wanted to make sure that everybody heard from the brilliant folks on this team, because frequently I feel like whenever we do RxJS talks, I end up blathering on for quite a bit about my perspectives on things. But everybody else here is putting out a phenomenal amount of material about this, or they know like where a lot of this amazing material is. So I would definitely follow them on Twitter and pay close attention to the things and the Medium articles and the things like that they put out, or their blogs.
I think generally speaking, though, everybody's pretty welcoming here, and feel free to reach out. Nobody bites, and we're always happy to point you in the right direction, or whatever level of contribution you like. So don't stress. It's not intimidating, we promise.
All right. Just hearing some voices in my ear. Right now, we're a bit over time. I would like to say thank you a lot to you, Tracy, Nicholas, Moshe, and Ben, from joining us from around the world. It's been a pleasure. I'm looking forward watching the stream again, more focused on the answers, because it's pretty tough, like having the prep document, following up on the next questions, having the timings and the voice in the ears. Yes, thank you very much. And yeah, to all the others outside, have a great day or night or a good morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.